Welcome back. I'm going to take just a brief moment to discuss reinforcing methodological paradigms. So, the first one I'm going to discuss is something called positivism. Now, this doesn't mean to be positive in the sense of being happy or being overly optimistic. It's more about being positive in the sense of being certain. How can you be certain? So, positivists argue that to be certain, or to have a good understanding of something, you must have an empirical base. It must be based on real, solid observations that you can measure. Hence, it wants data that can be objective and measurable. The fundamental roots of positivism lie in the natural sciences. So positivists had looked at the successes of the natural sciences and said, wow, we'd like to use these methods to study social phenomena. And so the idea here was to import positivist scientific techniques and philosophy and thus apply it to the study of social phenomena. Hence, positivists tend to prefer quantitative research. They want something that is objective, that does not depend largely upon who has done the research. After all, a scientific truth should be there regardless of who is seeing it. So it has this fundamental assumption about reality. And if you continue and look through the rest of this presentation, the parts that I will not narrate, that you will have to go through and scroll through yourself, you will see some of the assumptions of the scientific method. So now we want to contrast positivism with what qualitative researchers tend to prefer, which would be interpretive sociology. We'll call it interpretive sociology. Now, interpretive sociology emphasizes particular subjective meanings that subjects attach to their social world. So for positivists, this may be a little bit subjective, but for qualitative researchers, this is what society is. It is sort of a collection of perceptions that people have about their world that are influenced by the perceptions that people have that others may have of them, something we call actually the looking glass self. You'll learn about that a little bit later. If you've had some previous sociology, you may know what the looking glass self is. Briefly, it means that I see myself as I imagine that others see me. Hence, perceptions really predominate. So we want to understand what those subjective meanings are. We want to understand how people experience and live their social world. And that becomes the central focus of interpretive sociology. This argues that the social world exhibits less stability than the natural world, and thus different methods are needed to understand it. Positivists have, like I mentioned before, sort of imported statistics and statistical science and applied it to the social world sort of wholesale without much of a critical analysis. Interpretive sociology then also argues that findings are less definitive in the social sciences than in the natural sciences. Even in quantitative research, we still want to be cautious about claiming causality. There are very specific things that must be in place before we can do so. Also, rarely in the social sciences do we use the sort of deductive reasoning that B always follows A or A plus B equals C in every instance. In physics, for example, if you have an exception that happens, that's really problematic. In the social sciences, not so much. We expect a certain degree of error. But in physics, you can't have, say, gravity work 98% of the time and not work the other 2% of the time. That would be very strange. And if the equation works most of the time but not all the time, that's a problem. As a matter of fact, that leads to oftentimes a paradigm shift in that discipline. Interpretive sociology uses something we call Verstehen. And Verstehen is a German word that means empathetic understanding. So the idea is the qualitative researcher is trying to empathize with the subject, to see the world through the eyes of the subjects. So that is the case for interpretive sociology. One final paradigm here is critical sociology, and this gets at some of the ideas that positivism tends to hold. So extreme positivism, and I call it extreme positivism. Most researchers have a considerable degree of positivist philosophy within them, even if they don't consider themselves positivists. But extreme positivism tends to argue that the researcher should always be value-free. In other words, their personal beliefs and ideas should not have anything to do with their research. They're completely neutral, it's just a mathematical problem, etc. And critical sociology takes issue with that, and in part because it argues that the researcher exists within a particular socioeconomic context. And so this idea that you can be value-free doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you are actually placed within the social world. So you have some kind of value that even might just determine what your research question is, what topic you were interested in studying. All of that reflects values. Even if those values are in accordance with the mainstream, that's still a mainstream bias, if you will. So who gets to say who has bias and what's truly objective? Oftentimes, what counts as objective in our society without much critical thought is what agrees with the predominant mainstream media or mainstream account of social phenomena, which may differ quite a bit from what actually is going on. Finally, critical sociology argues for the need for social change. In other words, the idea here is not that the researcher is supposed to be objective in the sense of, or value-free, in the sense of not taking a position. The idea that you can become aware of social phenomena, social problems, certain roles of certain sectors of society, and not take a position is morally or ethically negligent in the view of critical sociologists. Kind of going from this idea that all that is needed for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing, then that, of course, is fundamental in terms of the idea of critical sociologists. And they may use quantitative, they may use qualitative, oftentimes they use historical comparative or participatory action research, different types of research methods that are used or preferred by critical sociologists. But I want to emphasize that all paradigms stress that topic studied should be value relevant, but they really differ just in which method is most epistemologically powerful. Thus, all of them also strive towards objectivity in terms of how they view the research process. They want to be faithful to their data. All of the different paradigms want to accurately and objectively present the data. They don't manipulate the data. They follow ethics in terms of how they view the data. They just have different ideas of how researchers should proceed and what the researcher's role is and so forth.